Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Pokemon Red and Blue, a role-playing game, or actually a couple of role-playing games, developed by Game Freak and published by Nintendo for the Game Boy Portable console back in 1996. We're going to take a look at those games in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 112, and it is another special episode because it is a Patreon-sponsored episode. This one sponsored by Sam Twardowski. Sam recorded a message for all of us to listen to. So Sam, take it away.
Hi everyone, this is Sam here, Hummel728 out on Discord. For my next sponsored episode, I decided to go with Pokemon Red and Blue. I remember when we first got the two versions of this game back in the day, and we kind of had a fight over who got which version. Tony got the red, and I ultimately went with blue, which definitely paved the way for Blastoise being my favorite Pokemon. Of course, I love the game. I loved so many hours on that in my Game Boy, leveling up, trying to catch them all. I still have the battle song lodged in my brain to this day, very iconic song. That said, the real reason why I chose this as my sponsored episode is not just because of how much I love the game itself, but also because of what it represents in terms of being the beginning of one of the largest pop culture franchises that exists to this day. It was so influential as a series in terms of, creating many media spin-offs like the trading cards, cartoons, other games, movies, so much more. For me personally, it also started me down the path of collecting and playing the Pokemon trading card game, which was a very important part of my life at the time. It was something that helped me introduce to a lot of people and made a lot of new friends. I still have my entire collection from back in the day, and even recently started collecting again because I'm that nerdy. Enough about me, though. Let's hear what Tony has to say about Pokemon Red and Blue. Thanks, all.
Thank you, Sam, for your message, your sponsorship, and your support. If you would like to sponsor an episode or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It's all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I'd also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context. How was the game made? Why was the game made? And then we move into a pseudo review kind of section. And I say pseudo review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and or story, if the game has one, playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they are still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go. But I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Pokemon Red and Blue. Pokemon Red and Blue are a series of sister role-playing games developed by Game Freak and published by Nintendo for the Game Boy Portable Console in 1996. Before we can talk about the very first Pokemon titles, we need to take a step back to talk about the company behind the game, Game Freak. And in order to do that, we need to speak about the company's three co-founders and eventual creators of the entire Pokemon series: Satoshi Tajiri, Ken Sugimori, and Junichi Masuda. While all three men would ultimately be responsible for bringing Pokemon to life, our story really starts with Satoshi Tajiri, who as a young child in the late 60s was fascinated with bugs and collecting insects of all kinds. So much so that his friends started calling him Dr. Bug, and he envisioned a future career as an entomologist, a career choice that his parents thought would be worthwhile for him to pursue. Tajiri's focus on collecting bugs and learning all that he could about the insect kingdom lasted into his teen years, and while his interest in bug collecting never truly waned, a new hobby began to pique Tajiri's curiosity in the later 70s that would end up shifting his focus from entomology to something different entirely. The 1970s, as we've talked about before, was the period of time when digital entertainment, and in particular digital arcade cabinets, began taking over arcades around the world. As a result of this digital revolution, the electromechanical devices of prior years began to drop in popularity, and arcade floor space that at one time was brimming with games utilizing physical levers, objects, and sensors was quickly overtaken by digital machines with monitors, joysticks, and buttons. And as this digital takeover continued to progress, children of the time, like Satoshi Tajiri, became enamored with the possibilities that this all-digital future could potentially hold, and Tajiri in particular began to spend more and more time at his local arcade, much to his parents' chagrin. Of all the new digital experiences that were becoming popular around this time, though, one game in particular became Tajiri's absolute favorite: Taito's 1978 shooter, Space Invaders. Tajiri loved Space Invaders, so much so that he would play the game any chance he got, and even if he didn't have access to a Space Invaders cabinet, Tajiri would seek out Space Invader clones as a means to sate his space shooter addiction. To say Tajiri was intoxicated by the arcade scene of the 70s would be an understatement, and it didn't take long before he began to consider that he could potentially make his own games. There was just one problem. The The video game industry at the time was still very new, and he himself was only 13 years old in 1978, which wasn't quite old enough to be seriously considered as a prospective employee in any well-established video game company. Sure, he could teach himself the art of game creation as a means of preparing himself for a future in the video game industry, much like other aspiring developers did around the same time. And for his part, Tajiri would actually come up with several game concepts that, despite his relative young age, were widely considered to have merit. In fact, Tajiri was so talented at such a young age that when video game company Sega sponsored a contest for fans to submit their own game ideas, Tajiri sent in one of his ideas, and he ended up winning the whole contest, an event that further proved to Tajiri that a future in the video game industry was a very real possibility. That future, however, was somewhat in doubt, as Tajiri was so interested in arcades and video games that he began to skip his school classes, creating a situation where he had to attend makeup sessions just to have the grades he would need to graduate. Luckily for him, those makeup classes worked just fine, and he was able to graduate from high school with his diploma without any significant issues. Tajiri knew, however, that his future wasn't in academia. It was in the video game industry, and as a result of that decision, he decided to forego attending university, though he did complete a 2-year technical degree at the Tokyo National College of Technology, graduating with a dual major in electronics and computer science, a degree that he believed would align closely with the skills needed to succeed in the video game industry. But as was often the case, actually breaking into the video game industry was not a foregone conclusion, and in the early 80s, Tajiri wasn't able to find a company to begin his video game career with. So he did the next best thing. He decided to publish his very own video game magazine. Recall that Tajiri loved going to arcades back in the 70s, and as the 80s rolled around, that love continued to deepen. Tajiri figured that he could apply that passion to something worthwhile, so in 1981, he began publishing a game magazine that he named Game Freak, which would have a focus on popular arcade games of the time, including strategies for achieving top scores, as well as Easter eggs that interested players could uncover by playing their favorite titles. This magazine, while entirely handwritten, manually stapled, and self-published, did in fact garner a degree of fame, with his top issues selling upwards of 10,000 copies. Not too shabby for an entirely amateur production. Beyond the impressive sales figures, Game Freak would also end up being influential for another reason. It would be the reason Tajiri eventually met artist and illustrator Ken Sugimori. One day in 1981, Sugimori was browsing a local magazine stand, and he came upon Tajiri's publication Game Freak. Thinking the concept seemed interesting, Sugimori picked up an issue and paged through the copy, and it didn't take long before he realized that there was something special here, and Sugimori took it upon himself to seek out the magazine's creator and, hopefully, become a member of Game Freak's publishing team. Now, to be clear, at the time Sugimori approached Tajiri under the auspices of working on the magazine, Game Freak's publishing team consisted of a single person, Tajiri himself, though Sugimori brought something to the table that Tajiri didn't have. Sugimori was a talented artist, designer, and illustrator, and he basically told Tajiri that if he let him join Game Freak, he would handle all of the artwork and illustrations for the magazine. Tajiri recognized that adding artwork to Game Freak would likely improve its potential sales, so he agreed to allow Sugimori to join the team, and from 1981 to 1986, the duo would continue to publish the Game Freak magazine, distributing them to various stores in Japan for interested individuals to find and hopefully buy. Over time, Game Freak would garner more and more readers, some of whom would end up contributing to the magazine, both by submitting games for review, as well as sending in ideas for future articles to write. And while Tajiri and Sugimori were running the magazine and receiving these submissions, something struck the duo. Some of the games they had been looking at, and in fact more than a fair portion of those titles, weren't really all that great. Sure, there were plenty of popular, well-designed games that Game Freak would cover, but there were also a bunch that were subpar, and given the expansion of the video game industry in general, it only stands to reason that the balance of good versus bad games would begin to shift over time. Both Tajiri and Sugimori were a bit disappointed with the state of the industry and the poor quality games they had been reviewing, so the two decided to do something about it. Rather than continuing to publish Game Freak as a video game magazine, they would instead transition Game Freak into a full-fledged development company. The duo figured that the best way to combat bad games was to create their own good titles, a sort of karmic offset that they hoped would bring more quality into the industry, one title at a time. So, Tajiri began to teach himself Family Basic, which was one of the programming languages used to create games for Nintendo's Famicom 8-bit console, while also buying all of the hardware he would need to create a full-fledged video game. At this point, Tajiri didn't have any sort of development contract with Nintendo, or any publishing company really, which meant that even if he was able to program a game for the Famicom, he wouldn't actually be able to release it for the system, at least in any form of official capacity. Still, the knowledge he gained while studying Family Basic was enough to allow him to convert that knowledge to the arcade game space. And in 1989, Tajiri, Sugimori, and new Game Freak hire music composer Junichi Masuda officially founded the video game company Game Freak, the evolution of Tajiri's previously self-published magazine. And shortly after Game Freak the development studio was founded, the trio would come up with their first game idea, an arcade title named Quinty. Quinty was a fairly simple arcade game involving the player navigating a grid of spaces, all the while he'd be attacked by computer-controlled enemies. The only way to combat those enemies would be to flip the tiles in the surrounding environment, which would smack into nearby enemies, knock them into walls, and subsequently defeat the bad guys attempting to attack you. Over the course of a number of stages, the complexity of the game tile designs, as well as the complexity of the enemies, would gradually increase, though at its core, this is a prime example of a game that is very easy to pick up and play, but a bit more difficult to master, a design philosophy that would become prevalent in Game Freak's future releases. Anyway, after turning the concept behind Quinty into a fully playable arcade experience, with Tajiri working on the design and various programming tasks, Sugimori creating the artwork, Masuda composing the soundtrack, and other newly hired members of the team contributing to the effort, Game Freak would have their first game ready to release. There was just one problem. Despite having a functional and fun arcade title, they didn't have a publishing partner, and Game Freak didn't have the capital to self-publish their game themselves. So they began courting various publishing partners, with one company being at the top of the list. Namco, the well-respected publisher of numerous arcade classics and hit titles over the years, and the company behind one of Tajiri's favorite games of all time, Xevious. Ever since Tajiri had been writing for Game Freak magazine, he always dreamed of working with Namco at some capacity in the future, and now that he had a game to potentially release to the market, he figured this was the perfect opportunity to forge a partnership with the company. So, Game Freak reached out to Namco to see if they could agree to a publishing deal, at least for the Japanese geographic region, and to the delight of Tajiri and others on the team, Namco agreed on the spot to publish Quinty as an arcade title. It was official. Game Freak had just created and released their first game. But Tajiri and Game Freak had loftier goals in mind, and while they were excited that Quinty was being published in Japan, they were interested in releasing the game internationally as well, and in particular, they wanted to enter the North American video game market. And not only did they want to enter the North American video game market, they wanted to port their arcade title Quinty to the Nintendo Entertainment System, the North American version of Nintendo's insanely popular 8-bit console platform. Taking matters into his own hands, Tajiri traveled to America and, in his words, rented a car and drove up and down the west coast of the United States, meeting with countless publishers in an attempt to secure a publishing deal for Game Freak's first title. Unfortunately for Tajiri, most of those publishers believed the game was too cute to resonate with American gamers, and Tajiri spent a good portion of his American adventure dealing with rejection. Until, one day, he met with Hudson Soft, one of the more prolific publishers of NES games at the time. Hudson Soft, like most of the other publishers Tajiri met with, thought Quinty was too cute for America, but rather than reject him outright, they proposed an alternate arrangement. If Hudson Soft would be allowed to alter the game's packaging and title to make it seem less cute, they'd publish Game Freak's game in North America. Tajiri believed this compromise was worth it, so he agreed to the deal, and after a short period of rework and decutification, which is a technical term, Game Freak's first game would be released in the United States, for the NES, under the title Mendel Palace. Upon its release, Mendel Palace would achieve a fair amount of success, with 60,000 copies of the title sold, while garnering a fair amount of critical praise, with some publications praising the game's colorful graphics, simple design, and engaging gameplay. While it wasn't what anyone would consider a blockbuster release, Mendel Palace's success in America, coupled with Quinty's success in Japan, was enough to convince Tajiri and the Game Freak team that they had the skills necessary to become a professional game development studio. With bolstered confidence in place, the team would begin thinking about different ideas for their next game, and here, inspiration would come from Tajiri's earliest childhood pursuits. Recall that Satoshi Tajiri, from a very young age, had been interested in collecting bugs and insects of all kinds, so much so that his childhood friends gave him the nickname Dr. Bug. Despite the fact that Tajiri would spend less time on entomological pursuits as he grew older, he still fondly recalled the days spent as a child collecting those insects, a joy that he believed the current generation of children in his hometown might never be able to experience. Because urbanization of the area had caused the insect population to decline, with more and more homes and businesses sprouting up that, in the process, removed much of the natural habitat that bugs and insects need to live. One day, as Tajiri was reflecting on his past and the joys that current children would not be able to experience, he came up with an idea. What if he could create a game that would allow children to collect insects, bugs, and other creatures in a virtual world from the comfort of their own homes? This was a way that he believed he could bring the pre-urban fun of insect collecting from his youth to the children of the modern day, while also rekindling the love of collecting that adults may have left behind as they grew older. While this potential new game was just a concept at this point, he really believed that this was something that would appeal to a broad game-playing population. So he pulled the Game Freak team together and they began to draft out a rough design of a game involving collecting a number of different creatures, the ability to level them up and learn new skills, and a fairly expansive game world with a variety of different encounters to experience and characters to converse with. Tajiri pulled all of these ideas and general design concepts together, and in 1990, he took a trip to Nintendo's headquarters to pitch the game to the company. The staff at Nintendo patiently sat and listened to Tajiri's pitch, though once the presentation was done, the feedback Tajiri received was not as positive as he had hoped. Pretty much everyone who heard the concept thought that Tajiri's idea had a lot of merit, but they also believed the idea to be too ambitious, something that wouldn't even be able to be created given the technology of the time, which in 1990 included 8 and 16-bit consoles, as well as portable devices like Nintendo's own Game Boy, which was Tajiri's target console. He really wanted to create this creature collection game to be a portable experience, and given the Game Boy was the least powerful console in Nintendo's lineup at the time, the idea seemed too far-fetched to ever become a reality. One person at the company, however, believed that Tajiri's concept could be turned into a functioning game, even on the limited Nintendo Game Boy hardware. The only question was, could one voice sway the collective rejection of the rest of the company's leadership team? Well, the answer to that question is, it depends who that singular voice belongs to. And in this case, Tajiri got lucky, because the one person who believed Tajiri's game should be funded as a full-fledged project was none other than Shigeru Miyamoto, the legendary Nintendo game designer whose string of constant hits and franchise successes made him the most influential creative talent in the company. Miyamoto believed Tajiri's creature collection RPG concept would be a worthwhile endeavor, so he convinced the rest of Nintendo staff to proceed with the project. And given the respect Miyamoto commanded, especially from a creative perspective, Nintendo did ultimately agree to give Tajiri and Game Freak the green light to proceed with their project. Despite the fact that they got the green light to proceed, though, the title was still incredibly ambitious, as noted by the rest of the Nintendo leadership team. So while work on the title commenced, with Tajiri handling the overall game design, Sugimori working on art and character designs, and Masuda composing music, there was a general recognition that the game was going to take a fair amount of time to create. So, while work on that future title marched on, Game Freak would end up working on various other games in the interim, including several titles for Nintendo directly, like Yoshi for their NES and Game Boy consoles, and Japan-exclusive Mario and Wario for the Super Famicom, in addition to a couple of titles for Sega's 16-bit console, the Genesis, or Mega Drive, depending on where you live. Still, while Game Freak would work on and release several titles over the years, there was still a continuous stream of effort being applied to Tajiri's Creature Collection title, with a number of evolutions to the game's design occurring over the extended development period. One of those evolutions would end up having a significant impact on the future of the title, and would itself stem from a prior gaming experience that Tajiri and Sugimori had years prior. Like we've talked about, Tajiri had always been an avid video game player, and Sugimori, for his part, was no different. Even while the pair were publishing their Game Freak magazine, they'd both routinely play the same games, not necessarily together, but oftentimes concurrently, so that they could talk about the games they were experiencing and potentially include notes about them in future issues of their magazine. Well, one day the two were playing Dragon Quest II, the second entry in Enix's popular Dragon Quest RPG game series, and an interesting thing happened. As anyone who has played an RPG before knows, some items are rarer than others, and depending on the game you're playing, you may need to grind for hours in order to acquire the item you're pursuing. Even then, regardless of how much time you spend playing a game, Lady Luck might not smile upon you. It's entirely possible that you may never get the item you're seeking, regardless of grinding for hours and hours. Well, that exact thing happened to Tajiri, who had spent a ton of time attempting to get a particularly rare item in the game. Sugimori, by contrast, was able to acquire 2 of those rare items relatively quickly, a fact that made Tajiri happy for his friend, but also a bit irritated that his luck was so much worse than Sugimori. Tajiri lamented the fact that there wasn't a way to trade items between players, the thought being that if someone got really lucky, they could potentially trade any extra rare items to friends and acquaintances, thereby offsetting the bad luck certain players seem to be cursed with. Unfortunately, the technology to allow player trades did not exist at the time. But the Game Boy, by contrast, did support a degree of multiplayer, which was accomplished using the link cable, a physical wire that could be attached to 2 Game Boys to allow for multiplayer and communication between 2 players. Tajiri considered that this technology might allow for the concept of trading between players, and considering his prior experience with Dragon Quest II, he became convinced that this needed to become a feature for this new game. The only issue with that was the fact that the link cable wasn't designed to facilitate data transfers between game cartridges. It was more designed for multiplayer gameplay, not sending data back and forth between Game Boys. This was a technical challenge that needed to be overcome, and luckily for the team, they were able to figure out how to make the link cable work for the purposes of transferring rare creatures from one player to another. And speaking of rare creatures, a good portion of the time spent working on the game involved figuring out just which collectible creatures to include with the game, including what skills each would have, what design each creature would receive, and what each creature would look like. And here, the limitations of the Game Boy once again came into play, as Game Freak had concepts for hundreds of different creatures that they wanted to include in the game, but at the end of the day, just didn't have the storage available to include hundreds of creatures on a Game Boy cartridge. Over the course of the game's development, the team would gradually reduce the total creature count to 150 unique designs, with Sugimori leading the team that would create the artwork for each creature, Masuda using the Game Boy sound chip to come up with different creature cries for each design, and Tajiri and the rest of the Game Freak team collaborating on which skills to assign to each creature. Based on interviews conducted with the team, this process of down-selecting and designing the creatures that would ultimately be included in the game took several years by itself, which was an enormous amount of effort that the team hoped would eventually pay off. As the game's design started to become more fleshed out, various other ideas began to be incorporated, with one incredibly influential concept coming from Shigeru Miyamoto himself. Miyamoto had become somewhat of a mentor to Tajiri, and had taken a personal interest in the success of his upcoming title. When Miyamoto heard about the number of creatures that could potentially be collected, and the fact that Game Freak figured out how to use the Game Boy's link cable to enable trading between 2 players, Miyamoto had an epiphany. Having a single game with collectible creatures, while fun, wouldn't fully exploit the ability to trade between players, because at the end of the day, anyone could technically find any creature in the game, given enough time and luck. But if you designed multiple versions of the game, each with some exclusive creatures, then the trading feature became almost a required capability if anyone truly wanted to catch every creature in the game's ecosystem. Tajiri and the rest of the team thought this was a brilliant idea, and from that point forward, the team decided on splitting their collectible creatures up between 2 different versions of the game, with the majority of creatures being universal, while a handful would be exclusive to one version or the other, making it so that players had to trade with each other if they ever wanted a complete creature collection. With that concept in mind, the team began deliberating on what to actually name this upcoming game, and here, numerous revisions were suggested over time, some of which were too similar to other pre-existing trademarked properties to be able to be used. Eventually, though, the team came up with an idea that they thought would perfectly encapsulate the concept behind the game. This creature collection RPG from that point forward would be known as Pocket Monsters, which made perfect sense considering that individuals would be tasked with collecting a ton of different creatures or monsters, and the fact that the game was being designed for Nintendo's portable Game Boy system, which technically could fit in someone's pocket. With the Pocket Monsters name now agreed upon, attention turned to how to differentiate the two versions of the game that they were planning to release, and here, the concept of colors and opposites came into play. First, though, a quick word about colors and cultures. As with almost anything in society, the concept of colors and what colors might be considered a quote-unquote opposite is unique to various cultures around the world. As a hypothetical example, the concept of black and white being opposite colors might be valid in one culture, but not necessarily in another culture, where the equivalent color pairing might be black and blue. While that example is purely hypothetical, the concept is very much a reality in the real world, and in Japan, one of those corresponding color opposite pairs is red and green. Well, it turns out that Tajiri and the Game Freak team believed that using colors to distinguish their Pocket Monsters titles might be a direct, easy way for individuals to recognize and realize they were buying one of two different experiences, so they decided to use the red and green color pair to denote the two versions of the title. With that design firmly in place, Pocket Monsters Red and Pocket Monsters Green would finally be complete and ready for release in late 1995. Only here, another somewhat related issue would end up delaying the game's release for another couple months. While the majority of Nintendo staff had been skeptical of Game Freak's ability to bring their creature collection RPG to life, over time, the team's progress began to impress a number of individuals at the company, so much so that Nintendo greenlit the creation of a number of tie-in products, most prominently a series of toys and eventually a collectible card game. Well, in late 1995, none of those products were ready to ship, so the decision was made to delay the release of Pocket Monsters Red and Green until at least some of those products would be in a releasable state. That would end up happening in February of 1996, which is when Pocket Monsters Red and Green finally came out in Japan. Initial response to the Pocket Monsters series was a bit mixed. While critics praised the game's design, gameplay, and insanely addicting core concept, the games just didn't sell all that well in the market, at least in the months immediately following their release. That, however, would end up being a short-term blip, as after those first couple of months, sales began to increase. And increase. And increase, so much so that the games rapidly became one of the most popular titles in Japan, with both the games and tie-in products selling incredibly well. This success made a port to other geographic regions a foregone conclusion, and in mid-1996, work on porting Pocket Monsters internationally, most prominently targeting North America, officially got underway. Now, we've talked about localization efforts before, and how oftentimes localization involves both the translation of in-game text, as well as the restructuring and replacement of certain cultural references that might not make sense to another culture. Well, in this case, the act of localization faced a previously unexpected problem, and as with some of the earliest design decisions behind the game itself, the major issue had to do with storage space. Recall that trying to fit 150 creatures, sounds, and discrete designs into a Game Boy cartridge was an incredibly challenging endeavor for the Game Freak team, and that's not even to mention the rest of the game's world, characters, and dialogue. By the time Pocket Monsters was complete, there wasn't an ounce of storage left on the game's cartridge. It was legitimately filled to capacity. As localization commenced, it became apparent that simply translating the Japanese-based kanji character set into an English equivalent just wouldn't work, because kanji is a more condensed type of text than the English language. Meaning, a single kanji symbol might represent an entire word, but still be stored in-game as a single character. That same word in English, by contrast, might consist of 7 letters, with each letter representing a character in the game's storage. What this means is that the storage space used by the original Pocket Monsters game was about to explode, because the English equivalent of the Japanese kanji text required significantly more characters and storage to keep on the game's cartridge. This, as you might expect, was an issue and would require the localization team to not only condense and restructure all of the game's text, but would also require rewriting all of the game's source code, effectively recreating the game to make it a reality. This was caused by a couple of different reasons, one of which, like I mentioned, was simply due to the differences between English and kanji character sets. But the other, perhaps more challenging issue, was the fact that the game's underlying code was a bit of a mess by the time it released in 1996, owing largely to the fact that 6 years of development is a long time for a game to be created, and over that time, a number of changes and evolutions were added to the game's design. This resulted in code that technically worked, but would be fairly tailored to the specific set of assets that made up the game. Changing the character set from kanji to English just wouldn't function in the game's original source code, which is why the whole game had to be reprogrammed just to facilitate the inclusion of English as opposed to Japanese text. As you may have guessed, that effort was extensive, though eventually, after 2.5 years of localization work, Pocket Monsters would be ready for release in the United States. As the team began to prepare for its final North American release, a few other decisions had to be finalized, the most important of which was how to market the game to North American gamers. A large contingent of the localization team felt that the game was too cute to appeal to the US market, a critique that was reminiscent of the feedback Tajiri received while attempting to sell his first game nearly a decade earlier. Only here, Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi would weigh in with his own opinion. Remember how I mentioned that the degree of agreement or dissension around an idea is directly related to which voices lend support to a given idea? Well, when the president of Nintendo speaks, the rest of the company tends to listen. So, when Yamauchi told the localization team that the cute aspects of the title were simply a challenge to be overcome, they basically said, "Yes, sir," and went off to figure out how to market the title. This would result in an absolutely enormous $50 million marketing campaign in an attempt to make the game appeal to North American players, along with a tweak to the game's name itself. Recall our discussion on color pairs, where in Japan, the colors red and green represent quote-unquote opposite colors. That designation might apply in Japan, but in the United States, red and green have no specific correlation to each other. Red and blue, however, that pair certainly strikes a chord, and because of that, Pocket Monsters Red and Green would become Pocket Monsters Red and Blue in the United States. Before release, there was just one final thing to do, and that was to make the name Pocket Monsters a bit more catchy. And here, the localization team actually took inspiration from the fact that the game was originally developed in Japan, a fact that the team believed they could potentially exploit. If only they could come up with a Japanese-sounding name that would still resonate with American audiences. The team brainstormed some ideas, before eventually realizing that the answer was literally staring them right in the face. What if they made a contraction out of the title Pocket Monsters, combining the two words to create a brand new word that hopefully would become a recognizable brand? That ultimately is exactly what the team decided to do, and with that decision, Pokemon Red and Blue would finally release in the North American market on September 28, 1998. Shortly after release, it would become apparent that any fears surrounding the game's too cute design were completely unfounded, as Pokemon would sweep across the North American gaming landscape, becoming one of the most popular titles of the year, one of the highest-selling titles on the Game Boy, and, in the eyes of critics and players alike, one of the best games of all time. From these early beginnings, Pokemon would become a mega blockbuster media franchise, with countless product tie-ins, including the aforementioned toys and collectible card game, an animated series, movies, and eventually, a full series of pseudo-sequel and spin-off titles. Pokemon would reach a level of success that few franchises could ever hope to achieve, with the original titles selling over 31 million copies in the several years following its release, with subsequent releases serving to inflate the overall franchise sales figures to astronomical proportions, with over 480 million copies of various Pokemon games sold as of late 2023, not to mention over 1 billion downloads of the Pokemon Go mobile title. And those figures don't even include sales of related products, which similarly are ludicrously high. Taken in total, the Pokemon franchise has made $150 billion since the release of Pokemon Red and Green in Japan in 1996, making it the most successful media franchise of all time. The Pokemon craze shows no signs of slowing down, as numerous modern titles continue to be released even today, alongside re-releases and pseudo-remakes of prior games in the series. And even today, the trio of Satoshi Tajiri, Ken Sugimori, and Junichi Masuda continue to be the main stewards of the Pokemon franchise, demonstrating not only their creativity, but also their continued belief and confidence in the simple creature collection idea that originated from Tajiri's childhood fascination with insects. Pokemon, perhaps more so than nearly any other franchise we've discussed before, is truly a pop cultural phenomenon and will likely remain in the public spotlight for countless years to come. The reason that is, and the reason why Pokemon became so successful, is simple. A core group of talented video game designers came together in the early 90s and collectively made something truly special. While the Pokemon franchise of today is far more expansive than those original efforts, the fact is that without Pokemon Red and Green, and by extension Pokemon Red and Blue, the gaming world would not be what it is today. And that, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is a fact that will never be forgotten. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Pokemon Red and Blue today versus when it was released back in 1996. Pokemon Red and Blue are the very first Pokemon titles ever released, which, like we've talked about, was the start of a worldwide phenomenon that took the gaming, toy, television, and collectible worlds by storm. Over the years, Pokemon games in particular have evolved, much like the monsters contained within each title, to encompass a number of different features, regions, battles, monster types, and myriad other enhancements that have continued to keep the series fresh, though consistent, over the last 25 years. Every global blockbuster gets its start somewhere though, so let's talk about that very first Pokemon experience, Pokemon Red and Blue. First though, a quick note. I only played Pokemon Red for the purposes of this discussion, though everything we're about to talk about really does apply to both Pokemon Red and Blue, because the two games are effectively the same title. They have the same plot and story beats, they have most of the same Pokemon available for capture, they have the same skills that can be acquired and taught to your Pokemon team. They're pretty much the same game. The only differences have to do with exclusive Pokemon that are only available in one game versus the other, and I didn't personally feel the need to experience the same game twice just to be able to fill out my entire Pokedex, which is the catalog showing details about each Pokemon you encounter and capture in the game world. Back when the game first came out, the fact that there were two different versions of the game led to a bit of a community springing up around the title, as players would take their respective Game Boys and Pokemon cartridges, link them up, and proceed to trade each other for various cartridge-exclusive Pokemon variants, all in the hopes of one day catching them all. In the days of physical interaction and actual in-person trading being the only way to possibly acquire a full Pokedex, short of trading with yourself if you happen to own both cartridges, this feature was amazing, and I still recall my brother and I segmenting our gameplay between our individual cartridges. I was Pokemon Red through and through because Charizard is the best Pokemon by far, and he appeared on the cover of the game's box, while my brother and today's episode sponsor Sam had the inferior Pokemon Blue version, which featured Blastoise on the cover. We'd routinely compare our different Pokemon, though Sam really did get into the collection aspect of the game, more so than I ever did. While he most likely had the more complete Pokedex back then, I still contend that Charizard is the best, and anyone who wants to challenge me on that fact can meet me on the schoolyard playground later today with their Game Boy and a link cable where I will prove Charizard's superiority to all of you. Recess taunts aside, there are very few differences between the red and blue versions of the game, and the version you ultimately play will be decided primarily by any specific exclusive Pokemon that you yourself want to capture during your playthrough. I played Pokemon Red to attempt to re-experience the same game I played as a teenager, but honestly, the discussion that's about to follow applies equally to both games. So let's talk about Pokemon Red, which is a role-playing game whose focus is to provide players with the opportunity to collect and train a number of animal-like creatures called Pokemon, all in the hopes of becoming a true Pokemon Master Trainer. As you build out your team and train up your Pokemon, you'll constantly be challenged by wild Pokemon that you encounter while exploring various environments, as well as other Pokemon trainers who have built up their own teams of Pokemon with the intent of proving themselves to be a better trainer than you are. Anytime you encounter a wild Pokemon, you're presented the opportunity to capture it using one of several different Pokeballs that each have different levels of effectiveness, depending on what level of Pokemon you're attempting to capture. The actual act of capturing a Pokemon involves a couple different steps. First, you need to deplete the Pokemon's hit points, and from what I understand, as long as you deplete its life bar to a third or fewer of its available hit points, then you've maximized your chances of capturing that Pokemon. Depending on the difficulty of that Pokemon, you may also need to apply a status effect, like sleep or freeze, in order to improve your chances of capture. And then finally, you need to pick the right quality of Pokeball to facilitate that capture. Based on my anecdotal experience, the quality of Pokeball doesn't have a huge impact on your capture rate, at least for normal Pokemon, where even after level 50, I was able to successfully capture common and uncommon Pokemon using a plain Pokeball, as long as I diminished its hit points enough to maximize the possibility of capture. Legendary Pokemon, however, are on a whole different level, and we'll talk more about those irritating foes in just a little bit. Anyway, your goal is to collect as diverse of a team of Pokemon as possible, because your success in battle is highly dependent on the types of Pokemon you have at your disposal in comparison to the types of Pokemon that you're battling. Pokemon Red utilizes a fairly traditional rock, paper, scissors type of mechanic, where certain Pokemon types are super powerful against other types, but also have significant weaknesses against a subset of other Pokemon types. As an example, take a fire Pokemon and have it attack a grass-based Pokemon, and you'll most certainly make short work of that opponent. Put fire against a water-based Pokemon though, and it's a different story, as your attacks will be mostly ineffective, while any water-based attacks will absolutely wreck your day. This type of combat mechanic was not new when Pokemon Red and Blue implemented it, but I can honestly say that the version of the mechanic included with these initial Pokemon entries is perhaps one of the more expansive implementations that I've seen from around this time. There are 15 different Pokemon types scattered around the game, and if you happen to have an original copy of the game's manual, or a digital version, you can see how the game maps different types against each other, rating each matchup as either great, normal, poor, or bad. Conceptually, I love this framework for the game, and when the game first came out, I remembered strategizing about how to acquire different types of Pokemon to make my team as diverse as possible in response to the other trainers I might face out in the wild, or the various gym leaders I'd need to defeat in order to acquire badges to prove my overall prowess for collecting and training Pokemon. In practice, based on my recent playthrough, there are some deficiencies with the system, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But I still think the concept is a good one, and one that plenty of games, the Pokemon series included, have utilized to great effect. Assuming you're playing the game the way its designers intended, you'll spend a significant amount of time seeking out various Pokemon types in the game world, capturing creatures to both augment your team as well as build out your Pokedex with more information about all of the 150 Pokemon that inhabit the game's world. You have 6 active slots for your team that you can bring into battles and trainer confrontations, and you can swap between those Pokemon at will as the battle progresses, allowing you to best match your Pokemon types against your opponent's Pokemon types. Luckily, there's also a Pokemon storage mechanic built into the game that allows you to maintain your entire Pokemon collection, depositing and withdrawing various creatures from your Pokemon bank as a given set of encounters may require. Most often when you're navigating the game world, each area or region will have trainers that utilize similar Pokemon types, and once you get to learn which Pokemon types apply to which Pokemon, you can pretty easily build out a team to tackle those challenges. Even more focused in terms of Pokemon types are the various gyms that dot the landscape of the game world, each of which are led by a different Pokemon trainer who has mastered a given type of Pokemon, and the core goal of the game is to beat all of the gym trainers across the world before testing yourself against the Elite Four, a group of Pokemon trainers who have a ton of high-level Pokemon with various types at their disposal. These endgame battles are the most challenging encounters in the game, and if you don't have a well-balanced team of Pokemon at your disposal, you'll likely need to compensate in some other capacity, either via leveling your chosen Pokemon to the point of being overpowered, or hoarding a ton of high-powered items to keep your team safe despite the additional damage that they may end up taking. And speaking of items, beyond the various Pokeballs we already discussed, there are a ton of other items peppered throughout the game, from various healing-based items, to short-term buffs, to permanent stat enhancements, to utility and support objects, to quest-based items, and even brand new skills that you can teach your Pokemon, assuming you have the right type of Pokemon available to learn those specific skills. The skills in particular warrant special attention, because there are two different types that you'll encounter throughout your playthrough. Technical machines, or TMs, are items that can be used only once to teach the Pokemon of your choosing a specific new skill, while hidden machines, or HMs, can be used multiple times to teach various Pokemon of a specific type the same skill. If you're actively working to build out a diverse team, you'll likely end up using many of the TMs you encounter throughout the game, as some of them, especially late-game finds, represent best-in-class skills that you really want your Pokemon team to have access to. Others are less exciting, and by the time I reached the end of my playthrough, I had a fair number of TMs stored up in my bank simply because, as I played the game, I gravitated towards a core team that I spec'd out exactly like I wanted, and a lot of the TMs became unnecessary to beating the content in the game. If you're more engaged with the collecting aspect of your entire Pokedex, I can safely say most TMs will serve some purpose, but you do not need to use them all in order to play and beat the game. HMs are a little bit different, as most of them contain special abilities that dramatically alter how you traverse the game world, or provide access to areas that you otherwise would be blocked off from. Some of them, like the Cut and Flash abilities, are downright essential because you cannot progress in the game without them, while others, like the Fly ability, aren't technically required, but make your life a whole heck of a lot easier if you acquire them. There are very few HMs in the game, but if you find one, you can almost guarantee that you'll need it at some point in your journey. Skill management and usage is actually something we should talk more about, because the way the game is designed, you really do need to be strategic about how you build out your team, and how you manage the individual Pokemon that make up your team. Each Pokemon can only know 4 skills at one time, and as you play the game and level up your Pokemon, new skills will become available to learn, not to mention the TM and HM skills that you may want to also teach to your Pokemon. Because you only have 4 slots available though, and because each time you replace one of those skills it is effectively lost forever, active planning of how you want to build up each Pokemon is essential to your enjoyment and eventual mastery of the game. Compounding the complexity is the fact that most Pokemon can evolve from their base form into 2 successively more powerful forms, each of which may have unique skills that you can eventually learn. A fully evolved, late-game leveled, balanced skill Pokemon is a sight to behold, and can make short work of even the most challenging enemies. The most challenging part of late-game combat, besides trying to match your Pokemon team types to counteract your enemy's team, is the simple fact that you'll have to progress through multiple consecutive encounters without much of an opportunity to replenish your skills, because each skill you have can only be used a certain number of times before you need to rest your Pokemon at a town Pokecenter. Typically speaking, the more powerful the skill is, the fewer number of times you'll be able to cast it before needing to rest. Similar in some ways to the magic system that accompanies most Dungeons & Dragons rule sets, for anyone who may be familiar with those. The most powerful abilities can only be used a handful of times before needing to rest, so you really do need to conserve those skills for the fights where they'll be the most impactful. At the same time, as you build up your various Pokemon, you'll likely want a mix of high-powered and therefore fewer cast abilities, coupled with lower-powered but more plentiful skills. Otherwise, you may find yourself without an essential ability to cast when you need it most. While combat makes up a core portion of the game, the other major focus is undoubtedly exploration. And here, the number of locations, towns, dungeons, and other zones that make up Pokemon Red's world is much more expansive than many other Game Boy era titles. There are a ton of places to visit and explore in Pokemon Red, and because different Pokemon inhabit different areas, you really will want to explore everywhere you can, whenever you can, because that's the only way you'll be able to develop a well-balanced team. The actual act of exploring can be a bit tricky, and trying to navigate using the provided in-game map is sometimes an exercise in frustration, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But putting those eventual critiques aside, I was floored by the size of the game's world, which for a Game Boy title was ridiculously vast. There's a ton of content here, and I appreciated the technical wizardry that must have been used to fit a game this big into a console ecosystem that was originally designed for smaller, more bite-sized kinds of experiences. Pokemon Red exceeded my expectations here, and I was legitimately surprised at how big the game was as I rediscovered the title during my most recent playthrough. We'll talk more about other aspects of the game, including my thoughts on other mechanics that the game's designers implemented for the title, in just a little bit. But first, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at, because back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have readily available information at our fingertips. Most of the time when we made a buying decision, we might have read some magazine reviews, we may have had some word of mouth, but otherwise, it was all about what the box looked like. Were we walking around the game store and we saw a cool box? Well, maybe we pick it up, flip it over. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might buy it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So for Pokemon Red for the Nintendo Game Boy, the back of the box says, Pokemon, gotta catch 'em all. You've finally been granted your Pokemon Trainer's license. Now it's time to head out to become the world's greatest Pokemon trainer. It's going to take all you've got to collect 150 Pokemon in this enormous world. Catch and train monsters like the shockingly cute Pikachu. Face off against Blastoise's torrential water cannons. Stand strong when facing Pidgeot's stormy gust. Trade with friends and watch your Pokemon evolve. Important, no single Pokemon can win it all. Can you develop the ultimate Pokemon strategy to defeat the 8 gym leaders and become the greatest Pokemon master of all time? And then some features. Collect up to 139 different Pokemon playing the red version. Using the Game Link cable, sold separately, trade with a friend who has the blue version to capture all 150. You'll need to use both versions, red and blue, to collect all of the Pokemon. Test your training skills by battling against a friend using the Game Link cable, sold separately. Save your Pokemon collection and game progress on the Game Pack memory. Requires basic reading skills to fully enjoy the entertaining story. And that is the back of the box for Pokemon Red, and there are some screenshots as well with a couple of captions. One says, gameplay on the Game Boy Compact video game system. And then there's another screenshot that says gameplay on the Super NES using the Super Game Boy adapter, both sold separately. And that is an actual adapter that allows you to play Game Boy games on the Super Nintendo, which does have a little bit of a different visual look than the traditional Game Boy screen. And I've got to say, the back of the box here absolutely sells me. It sold me back when it came out. It still sells me today. Of course, I know about Pokemon. Now, I understand the insane popularity and just the expanse of what Pokemon has become. Back when the game first came out, I did not know about Pokemon because it was brand new. I knew it was heavily hyped, but I didn't really know anything about it. The box totally sold me back then. It continues to sell me today, and it makes me want to play the game. Which, of course, I did for this episode of the podcast. And we're going to talk more about the specific aspects of the game that I encountered right now, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Pokemon Red are all pretty darn amazing, with a level of variety that was very rarely, if ever, seen in a Game Boy title. While the game's world and environments were all diverse and well designed, the real stars of the show were each of the 150 Pokemon that make up the menagerie of catchable creatures that you'll encounter throughout the game. Each and every Pokemon, whether base forms or evolved variants, all look entirely distinct, and the level of detail for each Pokemon is incredibly well done. When you consider how limited the Game Boy's hardware was, and how low the resolution on the Game Boy's screen was, it becomes a feat of genius-level art and game design that allows Pokemon to look as good and diverse as it does. Even scrolling through your Pokedex simply to look at the various Pokemon that you've captured or encountered throughout the game is a delight, and it's not hard to see why Pokemon as a franchise has evolved from these relatively humble beginnings with 150 different creatures into an absolutely massive bestiary with over 1,000 different Pokemon species across the various games that would follow. The unique designs of each Pokemon make you want to capture them all, and I can 100% understand why for many kids and teenagers of the time, Pokemon became their singular obsession. The art and overall graphics design is a huge part of why Pokemon became the phenomenon it is today, and the original team's artists deserve a ton of praise for creating a title that looked great when it first released, and still looks pretty darn good, even today. Animations and other visual elements of the title are a bit more limited and more clearly demonstrate the Game Boy's inherent limitations, as everything outside of the individual Pokemon designs feels a bit more bite-sized and compact. But even here, the quality is undeniable, and I especially appreciated the various on-screen effects that accompanied different skills that you can use throughout the game. While there is definitely some reuse here amongst different skills, the team did an admirable job of making each skill feel unique, which when combined with the diversity of the Pokemon collection itself, shows once again how this title exceeds every expectation from a visual perspective. In short, the game looks great, and for anyone with even a passing interest in classic or modern Pokemon, exploring Pokemon Red's original visual design is a great way to witness the origins of the Pokemon phenomenon, and is something that remains enjoyable to learn about and discover even today. Moving on to the sound and music, nearly every song in the game feels iconic, with numerous themes that have played a role in countless future games, television series, and even movies, and hearing these original tunes on Game Boy hardware proves just how talented the game's composer, Junichi Masuda, is. While nobody would ever mistake the Game Boy-style chiptunes as orchestral masterpieces, the quality of the music here is nothing short of outstanding, and the diversity of the themes that play throughout your adventure is significant. This is another example of a situation where Pokemon Red exceeded expectations, though strangely enough, the diversity of the music isn't even the most impressive aspect of the auditory environment for the game. That distinction, instead, belongs to the various sound effects that accompany each Pokemon. For those who may be unaware, each Pokemon in the game has a unique sound effect associated with it, which in the game's world is meant to represent the sound the Pokemon makes when it speaks, known as cries in the context of the Pokemon series. These sounds are all the equivalent of low-fidelity chirps, white noise, and other sounds programmed on the Game Boy's sound chip, and I've got to say, I absolutely love each and every one of them. There are 38 different cries built into the game, with several Pokemon assigned to each cry, so it's not like each Pokemon truly has a unique sound effect distinct from every other creature. But the simple fact that there is such diversity here, and once again included on a Game Boy title, is incredible. Now, just to level set expectations, these are truly very low fidelity sound effects, but the impact they have in making each Pokemon feel even more unique, especially when combined with the diverse graphics and design for each Pokemon, is some next level game design. I love that these were included in the game, and truly believe it's yet another way that the team behind Pokemon proved they wanted to create something above any and all expectations. Overall, I have no complaints at all about the auditory environment for the game. It's stellar, and despite being limited by the Game Boy's sound capabilities, it still sounds great. Moving on to the narrative and story, as the game starts, your character is a young, aspiring Pokemon trainer who has had a chance encounter with Professor Oak, a world-renowned Pokemon expert and researcher. Professor Oak takes you under his wing, explains the process of collecting and training Pokemon, and also introduces you to his grandson, another aspiring Pokemon trainer who you'll end up encountering throughout the game. Oak sees your latent talent and wonders, could you be skilled enough to become a master Pokemon trainer? In an attempt to assess and support your potential, Oak allows you to select a starting Pokemon from one of 3 different options, and explains that in order to prove your prowess, you need to explore the entire Kanto region, which is the geographic area that the game is based in, and battle each of 8 gym trainers who have all specialized in certain Pokemon types. If you can best all of those gym trainers, you may have the skill needed to battle the Elite Four. Beat those trainers, and you'll have an opportunity to face your greatest challenge of all, a persistent rival who constantly attempts to one-up you throughout the entire game. If you're talented enough to beat your arch nemesis, you'll be recognized as one of the greatest Pokemon trainers of all time. The only question is, are you up to the challenge? I've got to say, I really enjoyed the story here, which, while simple, is still effective in giving you a purpose and a reason for playing the game. As you play through the game and explore its world, you'll encounter a ton of different non-player characters who add some additional flavor, and you'll learn much more about the various Pokemon species and types that pervade the game's world, which all serve to deepen your engagement with the game. I'd never suggest that Pokemon Red has a world-class narrative, and it's certainly not as epic as many other RPGs from the 90s and beyond, but it is very effective at setting the stage for the game in front of you, and at the end of the day, you can't ask for much more than that. Moving on to the playability and controls, we already talked a good bit about the general structure of the game, so we're not going to rehash all of that here. What I do want to look at, though, are some of the mechanics and control schemes that we haven't yet discussed, as well as some design decisions that I believe could have been tweaked to make an even better gaming experience. First, I should mention that the game controls very well, with a simple control scheme that allows you to move around an overworld using your directional pad, while interacting with various items, creatures, and environmental features using the face buttons on your Game Boy. Other than the act of moving around the game world, which is 100% based on your directional pad inputs, every other aspect of the game is controlled and interacted with using a menu-driven system, similar in many ways to other contemporary RPGs. Having to navigate a series of nested menu options is pretty much an expectation for RPGs released around this time period, and for what it's worth, Pokemon Red is designed in such a way as to avoid a ton of menu traversal to get to the interactions or items or creatures that you're ultimately looking for. I appreciated the familiarity of the menu-driven RPG system, and also appreciated the fact that menu interactions, while a pseudo-requirement of the genre, were not cumbersome to navigate. If we move beyond the controls and focus more on the gameplay, though, we can see some design decisions that ultimately serve to detract a bit of enjoyment from the act of playing the game. The majority of these mechanics were conceptually fine, it's just their implementations that left a little bit to be desired. To start, let's talk about the act of traversing the game's world, which, like I mentioned, is pretty darn large, especially for a Game Boy title. While I enjoyed the size of the game world and the way that it is, for the most part, an open, interconnected environment, I did have some issues with how travel was handled in the game. The biggest problem from my perspective was how confusing some of the zone and area interconnections were blocked off, seemingly for no reason other than arbitrary gating, which is made more confusing by the town map you're given access to early in the game that depicts each town and road between them as continuous paths with no real obstacles to block your path. In some instances, this works exactly as you'd expect, and you can follow your map to help you get from Town A to Town B, which works the same way as you'd imagine any navigation-centric RPG to work. In other instances, though, pathways that appear in the map are blocked, either by a guard who needs a drink of water, or a sleeping Pokemon that needs to be awakened, or perhaps by the need to use an underground cavern to make progress, as opposed to following the very obvious overland routes. To be clear, I don't have any issues with certain paths being blocked based on your progression and the tools you have at your disposal, but when a map shows that you can get from one town to the next simply by walking down the road, and the reality of the situation is that you need to delve into a dungeon to go to the other side of that town, and then use a brand new route to actually get to the town you wanted to arrive at all along, it creates a confusing situation that makes navigation tricky. Making things even more convoluted is the fact that the map interface works unlike any other map screen I've seen. When pressing a direction on your D-pad feels like it chooses a random location and path for you to cycle through, as opposed to having paths be organized in a more sequential format emanating from your current location. Look, I get it. Map systems back in the mid-90s didn't have the same degree of fidelity as we have today, but I think there were some very simple design tweaks the development team could have made that would have eliminated, or at least mitigated, the majority of the confusion I felt. When you combine that convoluted sequence of zone connections, the unhelpful at times map, and the amount of backtracking you may have to do if you miss a key item or skill, you have a recipe for some tedium, and that's exactly what ended up happening for me as I explored the game world. This all became a bit of a non-issue once you received the Fly ability, which allows your Pokemon to fly to any location you've previously visited, but I didn't end up getting that skill until very late in the game, which meant I was forced to do a ton of walking. It's entirely possible I missed getting Fly sooner, and if so, that's on me. But I'd argue that there are likely other people out there who will encounter the same issue, and in those cases, the game becomes a bit more tedious than I personally would have preferred. Another aspect of the game that can become a bit tedious are the battles, especially when navigating a dungeon or other dangerous area, because the random battle system in this game can go totally over the top in terms of the number of encounters thrown at you. I'm not lying when I say that in certain dungeons, I couldn't take more than 3 steps without being waylaid by yet another random encounter, often with Pokemon that were both lower level and were ones I already captured. Now, I recognize that there's a set of consumable items in the game that can minimize the number of lower level Pokemon encounters that you'll randomly get pulled into, but I still think the base encounter rate should have been tuned down a bit. Without using that consumable item, which is called Repel in the game, the encounter rate was way too high with too little benefit. The good news is that you can pretty much run away from any encounter with a wild Pokemon without fail, which helps to reduce the overall tedium, since you're not required to battle through those random encounters if you don't want to. This was definitely a saving grace from my perspective, because without it, I could definitely see the game becoming too much of a chore to 100% enjoy. Moving on from random encounters and navigation, the next mechanic that I had a bit of an issue with was the inventory system, which admittedly is not all that different from most RPGs. The way it works in Pokemon Red is, you have a finite amount of space in your character inventory that limits the number of items you can pick up and carry at any point in time, which by itself isn't really an issue. And you have a separate inventory bank where you can store items you may not need immediately but may want to save for later. This also is not an issue. And that inventory bank, by the way, also has limited total slots for storing various items, which once again is not an issue. It's simply the way many RPGs worked around this time, and in some instances still work today. What is an issue, though, is the fact that you will pick up a ton of quest items as you play the game, and each of those items can't be destroyed or sold, which means over the course of the game, you'll effectively be losing inventory slots to those core items. While I appreciated the fact that the game wouldn't let me destroy a potentially critical item, I did not appreciate the fact that once that item finished being useful, like say after I had used it, it still couldn't be eliminated from my inventory space. Think about a game like Resident Evil, where you pick up various keys to help you progress through the rooms in the game's evil-infested mansion. Now, think about what would happen if the game didn't allow you to delete those keys once they had opened every door associated with the specific key. Assuming the item box system wasn't infinite, you'd have a situation where vital inventory slots would be taken up by now useless items, making you make some tough decisions about whether to keep or destroy items that are potentially useful. Well, this exact thing happens with Pokemon Red, and I really disliked the fact that I couldn't rid myself of any of these items, which did in fact make inventory management more challenging and frustrating than it had any right being. Moving on, like I mentioned earlier, the core concept behind the game's combat system has to do with matching the right types of Pokemon against your opponent's Pokemon in order to defeat them as efficiently as possible. And once again, I actually really enjoy that style of rock, paper, scissors mechanics that the game utilizes. What I didn't particularly enjoy was the way your Pokemon gained experience, which can make the act of leveling up and developing multiple Pokemon to be so time-consuming that at the end of the day, I determined it wasn't even worth it. The issue is that Pokemon will only receive experience if they participate in a battle, which means that even if you have a full contingent of 6 Pokemon on you when you enter a battle, a Pokemon won't receive experience unless they physically appear on the screen during that battle. So, if you want to level up multiple Pokemon at the same time, some of which may be vastly underpowered, your only recourse is to begin the battle with that underpowered Pokemon, and then immediately switch to a more powerful Pokemon, which will allow you to split experience between the powerful and underpowered creatures. Splitting experience like this can result in slower leveling, but does enable you to form a more balanced, equally leveled team. But I've got to question why the game wasn't designed to simply split experience regardless of direct battle participation. Requiring a Pokemon to be on the screen for several seconds in order to receive experience for a battle seems to me to be an entirely unnecessary restriction, especially when you consider that you can get an item later in the game that allows this split to happen automatically. So it's not even that the game's designers didn't consider you'd want to have this feature, it's just that they gated it behind having to capture 50 different Pokemon before it'd be enabled. I wish this experience splitting feature was included as a default, because without it, trying to level up a party of Pokemon truly is cumbersome. Which is why, after a while, I decided to level my main Pokemon almost exclusively, figuring that if I made my Charizard overleveled for the content I was tackling, that I might be able to overcome the various type matching mechanics entirely, and instead rely on a single ultra-powerful Pokemon to defeat everything else. For better or worse, I was able to make this work, and by the end of the game, my Charizard was so overpowered that he single-handedly took down the Elite Four, and my endgame rival without any help from the other Pokemon in my party. I recognize this is not the way the game designers intended the game to be played, but it was a much more streamlined approach than the quote-unquote proper way to play, and avoided unnecessary grinding that, at the end of the day, likely wouldn't have been totally worth it. A side effect of having one ultra-powerful Pokemon, though, is that capturing lower-leveled Pokemon, which is pretty much all of them at that point, becomes a bit trickier, and ironically, this also applies to the legendary Pokemon in the game, which can sometimes be inadvertently killed by an unintended critical strike by an ultra-powerful, super-overleveled Charizard. Seeing as how you only get a single instance of each legendary Pokemon in the game, an untimely death necessitates an immediate reload, because you'll otherwise be unable to capture those legendary creatures to add to your collection. This can be worked around with some forethought, but the added complication is that a couple of the legendary Pokemon are exceedingly challenging to capture, even with only a sliver of hit points and a super powerful Pokeball at your disposal. I felt like the catch rate for these encounters could have been tweaked a bit, which wouldn't have diminished their quality as a creature of legend, but would have diminished the amount of displeasure I faced when my Ultra Ball couldn't even land a single hit 20 times in a row against a barely alive Articuno. Seriously frustrating encounter design, and one that I felt could have been improved. I know that it might sound like I just had a ton of critiques, and yes, I think the game could have been tweaked to be a better overall experience. But the fact is that there is a ton to like here, and as the first game of the Pokemon franchise, it is surprising just how much good stuff is here. Everything the series would become known for over the next 25 plus years was outlined, at least in part, by Pokemon Red, and the team behind the game deserves a ton of credit for what they were able to accomplish. From my perspective, there are two discrete ways you could play Pokemon Red. Either you look at it as a traditional RPG with a goal to accomplish and a quest to complete, in which case the game can sometimes become a grind that is more tedious than fun part of the time, or you can look at the game as the most detailed virtual pet title of the 90s, with a huge selection of pets to choose from, each of which can be customized and grown to your heart's desire, in which case this becomes an experience with a nearly endless amount of content, most of which will delight players and keep them hooked for years and years to come. The camp you personally fall in will dictate how you feel about the game, though to be clear, regardless of your personal preference, this is still a good game. It's just that your overall perspective will shift depending on your personal goals, and it's important to recognize that if you do approach the game like a traditional RPG to be beaten, you'll likely find a pretty grindy experience that may or may not be 100% appealing. As a kid with a Pokezoo in his or her pocket though, it's an incredibly rewarding experience that, honestly, is pretty hard to put down. So what is our verdict on Pokemon Red? Well, Pokemon Red is a game that does a ton of things well, combined with some mechanics that make the game more tedious than I personally recall it being when I played it as a teenager. This is likely driven by the amount of free time I have today versus how much free time I had years ago, and I recognize that your personal perspective will vary depending on your own personal circumstances. From my standpoint though, Pokemon Red is a really good game that could have been outstandingly great if some of its mechanics were tweaked. All of the components were there, from the stellar graphics to the sound to the engaging story and world that you'll end up exploring. It's just that the way you interact with that world can sometimes be hampered by design decisions that actively make the whole experience a touch less fun, which is why for me, Pokemon Red is very clearly a golden oldie. It's a good game, and I think everyone should play it, whether to gather historical perspective into the origins of a multi-billion-dollar franchise, or simply to experience an interesting collection-based role-playing game. But it is not a perfect experience, and the level of grind and tedium you can sometimes feel can make the whole experience feel less engaging than it otherwise would have been. It's still a good game, it just doesn't quite reach that Pantheon level, which is why for me, Pokemon Red, and Blue for that matter, are surefire additions to our list of golden oldies. That was our episode on Pokemon Red and Blue. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on the Incredible Machine, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to build this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on the Incredible Machine. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.